Alright, so I am going to try and rank everything in WOTLK Classic by its difficulty to play. And I know I'm going to probably get some hate or some very angry comments. Can't do anything about that, so go ahead and leave them and I'll do my best to not answer them. So, the main purpose of this video, which can benefit you, is let's say you're thinking about playing a new spec or class, and this will give you a good idea of not only the whole class, but also the particular spec you might be thinking of, how difficult it is to play. Starting off with Blood DK. This is one of the easier specs, and I do believe in general for Death Knights, they have a little bit of a higher learning curve at the beginning, but once you sort of understand their rune system and how runic power and keeping the right things on cooldown and whatnot, they're not super hard, and Blood in particular is definitely the easiest spec. We have Frost Death Knight, and the main difference with Frost DK and Unholy DK, which is coming up, is that the Unholy DK will have to be microing the pet, which adds a higher level of difficulty, as well as in general just feels more fast paced. But Frost does get more death runes, which makes it easier to do whatever you need to do and less coordination needed for your own rune management. So I do think Frost DKs aren't super hard. I'll put them on the lower end of not difficult. And getting to the Unholy DK, they're definitely a little harder. You have to manage the pet, you have to manage him with the corpse explosion, and that's similar to a lock pet in a way, where you have to have this hub that will dispel people. In this case, it'll be the hub being the corpse explosion. So I think they're not super hard, a little harder though than the other two specs, but overall, once you kind of learn the beginning and you understand how they work, they're very forgiving. All DKs are, because someone kites you, chains of ice. Okay, you're gonna get hit with something, AMS. Okay, Icebound. You have a lot of very forgiving mechanics and abilities. You have constant slows with your desecration as well. So overall, I don't think they're super hard. And now we have Boomkin. Now, Boomkin's kind of unique in that I do think they're somewhat difficult because they do have the hybrid role, and I think all the hybrids in general will have to be doing a lot more things. You can't just pump damage the whole time. But they don't really have a lot of dispelling to work out. They have their decursing and abolish, but they're not using it a ton. And overall, they kind of just spam dots, jump around in Boomkin form, and throw out some cyclones, and then cast some spells occasionally. I don't think they're super hard, so I'll probably play them in the not difficult. They do have some stuff, of course, that makes them more difficult. Overall, I don't think they're very difficult. We have the Feral Druid. Now, this spec in particular has a lot of forgiving mechanics. However, they do have some difficult ones as well. And the forgiving mechanics are where you're constantly able to power shift, get out of any route or slow, as well as run quickly. Therefore, make it very difficult to be kited. And in particular, Frost Mages will really dislike you if you can shrink it to Deep Freeze, because they have nothing to deal with you. Immune to Polymorph at all times, and then you're just getting out every Frost Nova and root and slow, and you move quickly, and you hit extremely hard as a Feral. So other than that one matchup though, that's pretty skewed to be easy for the Feral, they still have to manage their Cyclone procs, their healing procs, going between their forms, managing their defensive cooldowns, maybe hard casting sometimes clones. That's kind of what makes a much better Feral exist in my opinion. I don't think they're super hard, but I wouldn't call them easy either. So I will be playing them in intermediate. I have the Resto Druid. I do think this is the hardest Druid spec. In particular, I think healers in general are just a little harder, but a Resto Druid has to manage when to go offensive with certain comps, when to go in and out of forms, like for instance, even if you're camping a tree form, you can easily get banished by a Warlock team, and Warlocks are pretty rampant, in particular in threes. And there's a lot to watch for, in particular just all your hots. Like a Holy Pally, for instance, or a Priest, they can pop some instants that give you a ton of healing, which Resto Druids do have in their Swiftman ability, but the others have a lot more often. And Resto Druids have to manage their hots. You know, you don't have any hots up, and then a swap comes to you, or a teammate that you didn't see coming, and then they'll die very quickly as you put one life bloom on them while they're at 50% health. That's not going to cut it. And for that reason, I think Resto Druids are pretty difficult. They can, though, have a playstyle in a majority of the time and in certain comps where they just camp in tree form. They don't really CC. They're immune to sap, they're immune to polymorph, and they're just throwing out hots, wild growth, rejuve, swiftmans, not casting very much. So in that case, they're not very hard, but balancing the whole picture of hotting everybody, being in the right form, not getting caught out of form with no hots or whatever it may be, I do think Resto is more difficult, so I'll be putting them in difficult. I have BM Hunter, definitely the easiest Hunter spec, but nonetheless, Hunters are quite difficult in my opinion. So even though they're missing prep as well as a few other quick mechanics, and they're more of a one-shot pony, sort of like a Demo Lock or a Combat Rogue, they still have a bit to manage, and for that reason I'll be putting them in intermediate. Now we get to the Marksman Hunter. Now Hunters in particular in Wrath are very difficult and unforgiving. However, Marksman really stands above the rest for a few reasons. One, It has high bursts and it's very explosive in that you can use a lot of things quickly all simultaneously versus the typical, you know, every global you hit an ability every 1.3 to 1.5 seconds for most classes. But with Hunter, you'll have things like Disengage, Deter, and Silencing Shot all up the global, and then add an extra level of complexity with your preparation. You do it all again. And you can also cancel Aura Deter, so you go from not being able to attack to attacking earlier than anticipated. Then on top of that, Hunters have no healing. BM Hunters have a little bit, but Marksman has none. And basically this spec is very fragile because you might make some mistake and then you get hit extremely hard. Maybe you deterred 0.2 seconds late, 0.1 second late, and you get hit by a Chaos Bolt. Or whatever spell it may be, like a Giant Lava Burst, maybe a Palm Pyro Mage if it's classic. Well, not that Deter even exists, but that is a few of the reasons why Marksman's hard. And then on top of that, you have to manage your pet, which requires a lot of micro. And if your pet dies and you can't get it back up, which is a lot of the time depending on your arena bracket or comp, you just kind of lose. You're missing so many of your core abilities as well as a little bit of damage. And for those reasons, I think Marksman is very difficult. It has such a high skill cap. It also has a lot of binds. You have so much you can do at all moments. Positioning is extremely important. You can't just have poor position. You get the difference between getting charged and then not getting charged or death gripped versus not can make or break games, make or break duels, 1v1s, whatever it may be, and make it so you don't have to pop cooldowns, do more damage, change the way they play, make them go defensive, allow your healer to catch up, mana up, whatever. It's just very, it can really landslide the way you play. So for that reason, it's very unforgiving, and I'll put Marksman at the top. I have Survival Hunter. Very similar to Marksman for a lot of reasons. You have to be a little more sneaky with the way you apply like a Black Arrow. You can't just let it get dispelled all the time. In some cases, you can't do anything about that, and then they just dispel it, and then there goes all your damage, your explosive shot procs. But Survival is still a Hunter spec. It's still difficult, and it still can do pretty decent. Some people have been watching videos, though, of, like, let's say, Rhett and a Survival Hunter from the original Season 5, and they think Survival will be good this time around. It won't be. That's just because different balance patch, and totally different meta as well. So don't expect that if you still think Survival will be good. But it's a decent spec. Hunters are still good, and it can do good damage, but it has a lot of weaknesses that Marksman just doesn't. So I'll put this one pretty high as well, but I'll still have Marksman a little higher because of the way it ends up playing. Now we get to the mages. Now, all three mage specs I think are overall pretty difficult. Some are easier than others. In particular, like Fire, for instance, you can be running around a lot and you'll be getting immune to interrupts. You'll have a 20, I believe it's a 20-second undispellable buff where you're immune to silences and kicks after you've been kicked once. So you can just kind of cast, get kicked, and then you're good. So that's a very forgiving mechanic. And on top of that, you can just disarm people who attack you. You can run fast when people are on you. You have a few CC setups with like getting proper Dragon's Breaths, you know, kind of like a Priest does with Psychic Scream. But overall, I don't know why I'm skipping Arcane, but I'm just going to Fire first. And Fire, overall, it still has some stuff it has to do. It's not the easiest, but I do think it's the easiest of the three specs in most circumstances. So I'll be putting Mage, though, probably on the higher end of not difficult, but maybe it should be lower end of intermediate. But Fire is definitely the easiest, but Mages overall are still more challenging. I have Arcane Mage. They don't have as much that they can do as a Frost Mage, so they're naturally less difficult. However, they're punished very hard for positioning, and they really need to get a proper setup. They almost feel like a combat rogue in a way where you just have to get the right setup and then pop your cooldowns and whatnot, of course. And they do have an instant spell, which can be kind of easy in a way. Just, oh, I can't get a poly, I'll just instant cast it. But in a way, a lot of classes will have something like that where they can cover something and then get a CC off. Overall, I do think Arcane is somewhat difficult, and I'll be putting it more on the higher end of intermediate. Now we go to the Frost Mage. Now they have so much they can do with all of their roots and slows, including Imp Blizzard with the Undispellable Blizzard, the rank 1 Frostbolts, you get the Frostbite procs, and there's just so much to do in general for them. I do think, in a way, they're easy against some things, like let's say you're 1v1ing just some melee, for instance, but overall, Frost Mages have so much they have to do, so much to watch out for. They're very fragile. Also with Mages, if they get kicked, they can't ice block, but there are some specs that can get kicked and then use their defensive spell. But a Frost Mage, they start doing a Frostbolt, they get kicked, they might just die. And on top of that, Ice Block is mass dispellable and also Shattering Throw. So that's huge disadvantages for all the Mage specs. And also they have so much they have to do, in particular when another mage is in the game. And that comes in where they're protecting their own buffs with slow falls, arcane intellect, dampen magic / amplify magic, and of course swapping armors depending on what the situation is. Then having to throw out decurses, and then spell stealing another mage. That really adds a lot of complexity. And of course, just having a ranged instant silence that can kind of turn the game, as well as juking. You do have to cast a decent amount as a frost mage with your polys and frostbolts. Even though you have a lot of haste, regardless, you're still casting a lot, and that naturally will make it a little harder because you constantly have to be watching out for things and juking them, and having like enhanced shamans riding you, as well as a feral druid, BM hunter. So I think they're quite difficult, and I would put them very high. I'll probably just put them a little ahead of Resto Druid, but they're pretty difficult. All right, so now we're getting to the Paladins, and we're starting off with Holy Pally. And in particular, I do think they're the easiest of all of the healer specs. However, keep in mind that the easiest of the healers is not easy. All the healers at the highest level are difficult. And Holy, what makes them a little more challenging in a way, for instance, like a priest. You could kick either their shadow or their healing school, and then they'll be able to just swap to the other school. Versus a Holy Pally only has holy spells, and without the Aura Mastery, you start casting, which of course you don't have to cast as much with instant flashlights, instant holy shocks. But nonetheless, having just one school is a bit of a downside, and naturally they can't just cast one spell and then do whatever. Like a mage can cast something and then start doing dispels or mana shields or slow falls or whatever to build some dispel protection. While Holy Pally is just like, I can't really do anything. Nonetheless, I'll be putting them in intermediate because I do think all healers at the highest level are more difficult. Now we'll go to Prot Paladin. Prot Paladins are very resilient. They can dispel. They have overall very good mana when they're getting hit, and usually they're getting hit enough that it matters that they can keep up their Divine Plea. But not the hardest of the Paladin specs. I do think this is probably the easiest. It has a ranged silence slow. That makes it so it's much harder to get kited, on top of being able to freedom yourself, dispel yourself, and of course throw out dispels on other people, which is where really any of the difficulty comes in, is doing the utility of dispelling allies, freedom, sacks, and bops. So overall, I don't think I'd put them very high, probably somewhere around here. Actually, I'd probably put them below the other DK specs. I have Red Paladin. Now, they're a little harder. They do have to weapon swap. They're a lot more fragile in a way. And they do have to get a proper setup, versus Prot just pumps out tons of damage. Versus the Ret's a little more burst oriented, and naturally that leads you to have to set things up. So I think I would put them a bit higher, but not super high. I do not think Ret is extremely difficult. But nonetheless, you still have to be watching your allies, doing the proper dispels, not dispelling UAs, or managing your risk when you're doing dispels, and making the quick judgment calls of, oh, they have 3 stacks of Winter's Chill, their Poly's got 3 seconds left, and then maybe they got another debuff. Probably not even worth the dispel in this situation. Do something else. So that's something to watch out for. Versus a priest has a double dispel. That makes it so they can get a little more things off. It doesn't matter as much if they waste a global. Versus a pally, it does. So I'm going to put Ret a little higher, but I'm not going to be putting them super high, and I will be putting them below Holy. Now we're getting to Guardian Druid, which is the Preg Paladin. I will put an overlay so that this doesn't look like a pop print, but it's basically like Ret. It doesn't have to weapon swap, but it has to do everything else that Ret does, and it's very similar. I will say it's slightly easier than Ret because of that, just because you don't have to weapon swap, but really it's almost the same thing. All right, now we get to the Priest, and in particular Dis Priest. Now all 3 Priest specs have Shadow or Death, and that ability alone adds so much to the skill cap. Just on face value, a rogue's running over to you, or a hunter disengages towards you and they're about to scatter or blind, or a pally maybe turns towards you, gets in range to repent you. If you're paying enough attention, you'll be able to death these abilities. And then we go 1 level up. Let's say they're paying attention to how much you're paying attention, and then you know that, then maybe they will do that to feint you, to then get a death blown so that they can use one of those abilities. So then it adds a mind game at the higher levels of play, and it really adds a ton to the skill cap. And that's why someone like Hydra in particular was able to showcase how good he was above everyone else for so many years getting rank 1 class. So I do think Dis Priest is pretty difficult. It does have one forgiving thing in that it has 2 schools of abilities. So you get kicked on casting a heal, then you can go Fear. I mean, instant cast AoE Fear is also pretty strong, and that in a way is pretty forgiving. Nonetheless though, they're pretty squishy. They have a huge trouble getting trained by some melee like a warrior or a unholy DK, even frost DK can be very annoying. Add that with anything else, and then you're in a lot of trouble. They have to really manage a lot of things as well between dispelling themselves and dispelling opponents, knowing when to go offensive versus being defensive, naturally having that kind of hybrid role versus like a Holy Pally doesn't have much offensive pressure ever, so they just play very defensively, kind of like a Resto Druid who's camping in tree form. So they're quite difficult, and I would say, I'm trying to think of whether they're harder or not than a Resto Druid, but I do think Disc is pretty difficult, and I think maybe they're slightly more forgiving than Resto Druid in that they're not so hot dependent. They can instantly pop a shield, a palm, a renew, whatever, and get a lot of healing versus a Resto Druid. Might start with one hot, do a Swiftman, the hot's gone, and then maybe they're purging you and you're just hitting these hots that do nothing. Versus a Disc Priest can get a lot of spell protection very quickly. Very quick. I mean, you get like 5-6 buffs up on you in 2 globals. So I think Disc is probably just slightly easier than Resto Druid, but kind of depends on the comp. If you're camping in Resto Druid form or in tree form all the time, that's the easier playstyle of Resto. And Disc rarely is in that playstyle. They're kind of having to balance offensive pressure with defensive all the time. Now we get to Holy Priest. It's just really poor overall. It's so fragile. I mean, Disc is kind of fragile already, but Holy is very fragile. It doesn't have Focus Will, doesn't have Pain Sup, and you heal people after you've died. That's sort of the best thing you do. So Holy naturally just doesn't have as much potential to be difficult because of how bad it is. And not having Penance is also sort of a skill cap thing that it's missing. So I'll put it quite a bit lower. I don't know exactly where to put this. This is probably the one spec in the whole list where I haven't played it, and it's probably somewhat challenging, but not super challenging. So I'll be putting it probably in just not difficult, but maybe deserves to go in low intermediate. So we'll just put it there. No one's gonna be playing Holy, so I don't think it's gonna get mad over that. And then we have Shadow Priests. Now, they get kicked in their Shadow School, they can heal. Enemy cast their defensive cooldown, Dispersion. That is something a Frost Mage or any Mage spec would really like, being able to pop their defensive and then reposition and get mana back while you are kicked. Nonetheless, though, they still have to dispel allies, themselves, opponents. They have to manage their mana. They have to off-spec or off-heal. All right, now we get to the Shadow Priest. Now, all hybrids have the added difficulty of being able to heal and knowing when to heal / going offensive, when to be dispelling versus going offensive or healing is a lot of quick decision making that is added. That adds a few layers to the spec. The one thing or two things that Shadow has that makes it a lot easier is that, let's say you're casting Shadow School, you get kicked, you can not only pop your defensive, which also lets you reposition and get mana back, but you can also just heal or even do damage as a holy spell. Nonetheless, though, you still have to know when to be offensive, defensive, when to dispel, when to not, who to dispel, ally, opponent. Maybe your ally has 7 debuffs on them, and one of them is extremely important that you have to get it off. You have to make that quick decision whether you should even risk the chance of not getting it or do something else. So I do think Shadow is somewhat difficult. It's not the hardest, though. And in particular, when you're not having to add in any allies, which is, 1v1ing, which I'm not doing for this list, but that's where they're really not too hard. And I would be putting them, somewhere down here if we're talking 1v1 situations. Nonetheless, though, we're not. And so I'll be putting them in intermediate. And they're really a lot like Ret Paladins and Prague. They're very similar, I think. And they have very similar playstyles. They both have to watch their positioning, but not super hard like a Hunter does. So I'll be putting them right about there. They could go up or down. Right now we get to these Shamans. Now, all Shaman specs do have this ability called Wind Shear and Wrath, which is a 5 to 6 second cooldown depending on your talents, which is a very high skill stealing ability in that you constantly have to be using it. I mean, you can do this at least 10 times a minute if you're doing it on cooldown and you're not even talented. So Wind Shear alone makes it so you have to have constant awareness of everyone around you, where they are in reference to you, because you have to be facing them when you do your Wind Shear. It's not like you can cast a Corruption and it gets the guy behind you. You have to be looking at them to get the Wind Shear, which includes loss, of course, as well as the range. So that adds quite a bit of difficulty in knowing where to position. And on top of that, then you have things like your Grounding Totem. That ability alone, to get the right spell, like if a lot of spells are going off, let's say you're against a DK and a Shadow, and you want to get like a Horror or a Death Grip, you have to time that in between all the other abilities, like an Icy Touch, or a Chains of Ice, or a Priest's normal abilities like Shadow Pain, DP, Touch. And that will add a lot of difficulty. And on top of that, you have to and your totems. You have to have your totems in a safe location, or they'll also still help you. Like a Tremor totem has to be near you to pulsate. And if you have it too far and you get feared and you get feared out of range of the Tremor, then that's not good. So there's a lot of complexity with the positioning of, in particular, the totems, but also you. And I think that adds a lot of difficulty, and that applies to all 3 specs. And they all play a little differently, so naturally it's a little different, but nonetheless, they also have the ability to go offensive and heal. They all are hybrids, as well as Resto just being a big healer. So starting off with Elemental, I'm going to be putting it probably somewhat high. I'm not going to put it in difficult, but I will put it pretty high in intermediate, as if they get kicked, they can't heal. They can't use most of their abilities unless it's like a Lava Burst. But their Nature School is where most of their damage abilities, as well as their CC, as well as their healing is. Kick their Lightning Bolt or Chain Lightning, they can't do most of their damage, and then they also can't heal, and they can't Hex, and they can't Purge. So that's a big downside. However, in Wrath, they did make it so Shamans could get totems down while silenced. That was not something that they had previously, and that is a huge buff for Shamans, and naturally lowers their skill cap slightly. So that's where I'm going to put Ellie. They have to know when to be offensive, when to be purging, when to be healing, setting up bursts constantly. They're a lot like Shadow Priests, but they have the added complexity of the totem management as well as the constant kicking. That's why I think I'll be putting them there. I mean, maybe Mage should go slightly higher, but we're just going to have them close for now. And now we get to Enhanced Shaman. Now, Enhanced Shaman is a lot like a Ret Paladin, that they constantly have to weapon swap. Not constantly, but depending on what comp they're against, they probably will. And that includes putting on a shield, maybe even a healer weapon, versus just sitting with your 2 slow axes on or whatever you're using. They do have a lot of pressure though, in that they're constantly on somebody and they can just be hitting them and really stop the opponents from doing a lot. Nonetheless, the Shaman still has all the complexity of totem management, grounding, constantly kicking. They will typically run the 5-second kick, so that'll allow you to get 11 to 12 kicks per minute. There's a lot of disruption, and naturally they can purge as well, which they'll be doing a lot of the time. I do think they're easier than Resto and Ellie, but not by a lot. It's really not a large margin. So I'll be playing them probably somewhere around here. You know, maybe put Fire ahead of them, but there's not a huge gap here. Now I get to Resto Shaman. Now, if they get interrupted in their Resto School, they can't do most things. And just like Ellie Shaman, that is a bit of a hindrance. Ellie at least can do Flame Shock and Lava Burst. But Resto gets kicked, they really can't do much. They can do a Frost Shock, Flame Shock, but they're not casting Lava Burst. They'll probably just be putting down some more totems, but they have to really watch their positioning big time. They don't have to really go offensive almost ever. Their offensive version is basically just purging, which is a little easier to do that than to start setting up bursts and juking. So that's not as difficult. Like I would say a Resto Druid is probably a little more difficult. Also, Resto Shaman's more forgiving in that a lot of its hots are very powerful and they last a while. Like an Earth Shield, kind of annoying to get rid of, and you can just put up Earth Shield and it lasts a while. Riptide, a long buff as well. Typically you glyph, I believe, for the longer Riptide too. So naturally it lasts a long time on a lot of people because you'll just be running that on everybody unless they're focusing one person. And unless so, totems, being a healer is very unforgiving, and you have to watch all your allies as well as your enemies' positions, their CC coming out on you, your allies, and then decursing and whatnot. But they don't have a normal dispel, so that removes a little bit of difficulty. Nonetheless, though, I do think they're pretty difficult, and I'll be putting them in the second tier. Actually, real quick, I do think I'm going to lower Survival Hunter just a little bit because Marksman is a lot harder. Just if you look at the talent changes that they get, one has Silencing Shot, which is off the global, and then Preparation, which allows you to do a lot more things, of course, and then also Chimera Shot is actually somewhat complex. You will want to be using that with different stings to get the Disarm, which could be very clutch against a Bladestorming Warrior or maybe a Dancing Rogue or some other thing. So I am going to lower Survival a little bit. I do think Marksman, though, is no question the hardest so far. And now we got the Warlocks. So starting off with Affliction. I do think Affliction is probably the easiest of the three, or possibly Demo. Affliction can do a lot of dots. It has to manage a lot of different targets. And once you kind of coordinate that pressure, and you've done enough repetitions of it, which that's what Affliction is, just tons of repetition of managing maximum pressure with CC. There's still a bit to manage, but typically you're just getting healed and you're kind of doing your own thing, and you're not having to coordinate any sort of burst most of the time with most people. You're just putting constant pressure out, sort of like an Unholy Decay. Nonetheless, so you have to manage a pet, you have to manage your pet to spell, and you have to manage positioning with your portal and reapplying your portal. So Affliction is nonetheless not easy, and I will still be putting it probably somewhere around here. But Affliction is somewhat difficult for sure. Now we get to Demo Lock. Demo is kind of just like a one-trick pony, but it still has stuff that it has to do, and it has to apply its pressure in the proper way, but it ends up playing a lot more like a BM Hunter with a little less of the difficulty. So I'll be putting them a little bit lower, but not a ton lower overall. And now we have Destro Locks. Now they have to really be coordinating their bursts. I do think this is the most difficult Warlock spec for sure. You have a little bit of forgiveness in general as Warlocks, but specifically as Destro, where you have your Fire and Shadow School. You can Incinerate kicked or whatever, which isn't super often. You can start Shadow Bolting. It's not a big deal. And they do need to get their burst though synergized versus Affliction, like I said, just pumps out damage the whole time. Destro really needs to get CC chains lined up, get trinkets blown, and then get in a position where they can also burst while getting the CC. A lot of times maybe you can get a CC chain going, but you won't be in a position to actually burst the target down because they're near loss, or some sort of thing will come into play that will prevent you. So I think they're definitely a little more difficult than the other specs. And you still have to manage the portal. You still have to do the pet CC and micro, which as Destro you actually use 2 different pets, maybe even 3 sometimes. That's typically Succubus and Fel Hunter, but usually Succubus. And keeping that alive in particular is a little harder because the Succubus is so squishy. So that adds a little more difficulty, I think, than like the Affliction Lock, who's just ... Pet's dying, okay, start healing it. Or maybe whatever, get away. Versus the Destro really needs to get that burst up. So I'll be putting it a bit higher. I'm probably going to put it probably around here, around Ellie. And you could maybe even argue for it being above Ellie, but I do think Ellie has just a little bit more to watch for, but that's where I'll put it. And now we get to the Warriors. Now, you're asking me to rank Arms Warrior for Classic or BC. I would rank them very low. I'd be putting them probably here, maybe down here. I do think Arms was not very difficult in general in those 2 expansions, but in Wrath they have added so much to them. They are no longer the kind of easy class that they... You have a lot of regeneration, which just gets higher throughout Wrath, and naturally with all that regeneration you can do a lot more abilities, and then you have more mechanics like having to watch out for when people are casting, so you can get overpowers to land your brutal Unrelenting Assault ability. And on top of that, you're constantly having to stance against a lot of stances. Time to watch out for your reflex. The whole metagame's quicker in general, so that makes you have to be quicker with your sort of spell reflex, your defensive play. Naturally, if a mage now has 30% haste versus in BC they had none, besides like the trinket from BWL or whatever else they had, you have to play a lot differently. Everybody has a lot of haste now. Destro Locks in particular have a backdraft talent, which gives them a ton of haste on their abilities, as well as just having a lot of passive haste, because that's what their main secondary stat is going to be. So an Arms Warrior has to deal with the whole meta being faster, as well as them having to do a lot more than they did, and then having to manage something like an Unrelenting Assault, and of course positioning and everything else. You can play a Warrior, just pure do damage, do a lot of pressure, and you can still do pretty well with just that, but to get to the highest level, you really have to manage your defensives, your positioning, and everything else you have. A lot of weapon swapping too. You have to take people out with shield bashes. You have to then land, of course, the shield bashes. Go sort of defensive, but not pop all your defensive cooldowns. Watch out for when a disarm might come on you, like a dismantle, which will prevent you from using your big defensive cooldown like a shield wall. You can even use shield wall in DC. So they have a lot more difficulty than they used to. Nonetheless, they still don't have to really help their allies. They don't have dispels. They just have really intervene, and their only real CC besides their charges is their fear. So they don't have the overall kit of some of these other ones defensively or utility wise, but overall I think their core is a lot harder than it was, so I'll be putting them in intermediate. All right, Fear Warrior, basically the same things Arms, just they do less. They don't really have to set up a Blade Storm kill with making sure that they can't get disarmed or positioned properly to avoid a disarm, and overall they just can't do as much, so I'm not going to put them as high. I do think pretty much everything in Not Difficult is harder, but Fury still has some stuff it has to do. It's just so bad you can't do a lot of those things anyway. I mean, maybe it should be a little higher, but you know, it's not super far off of these anyway, I guess. Okay, now we have Prout Warrior. Now, unlike a Blood DK, unlike a Prout Paladin, they're actually not very tanky. Most Prout Warriors will run very high damage gear. They will have very low resilience, sub 300 resilience for the best gear setups, and that makes you very squishy. On top of that, you don't have a ton of healing. You don't have second wind. Only arms has that. So your only healing is blood craze if you even talent for it. Otherwise, you just talent for more damage. And arms also can reflect on allies with this one talent. And so you're having to watch out who's casting on who and when it's going to land, and then deal with juking. So you constantly have to do more reflect juking and watching out for that. And then being so fragile, you can just die to dots. A DK's dots and some Warlock dots like an Affliction Lock, they can kill you extremely quickly when you have that low resist setup, and you can't reflect anything once they're on you. So they're very unforgiving in that sense, sort of like a Marksman Hunter is. They can do very well against a lot of melee because they have a lot of armor pin, and then they have a ton of block, dodge, and armor. But the overall damage they take from dots or magic damage is so high, and that is where they really suffer, and that makes them a lot more unforgiving. So I do think they're a little harder than arms. Not a ton harder, but definitely a little bit harder, so I'll be putting them ahead of arms. All right, now we get to the rogues, the final classes. Now, I actually mained rogue back in Wrath, and I'm not doing it this time around, mainly because of hearing things, but I might still play rogue, we'll see. And I think they're extremely difficult. All three specs, but we'll get to the final one soon. Assassination does not have Shadow Dance. It does not have Shadow Step. Both of those abilities add so much difficulty, because if you want to go kick somebody far away, like a healer who's casting, Assassination has to run all the way over, sprint, or vanish. Most people have eyes. You can see that coming. So Shadow Step, on the other hand, though, is an instant teleport where you can instantly kick someone. You can even Shadow Step, not kick, and that creates a juke from them, and then you can do other things with that, like go for a gouge, or maybe a vanish, or Shadow Dance into a cheap shot, CC out of that. There's a lot you can do with sub. We'll get to that. But Assassination still has prep, and still has to kind of manage its deadly poison as well as its positioning, because if it's popping the wrong cooldowns or letting itself get kited to the wrong areas, it can flop very easily. It doesn't even have cheat death. It doesn't have Shadow Step to really kind of get away, or Shadow Dance to kind of create some defensive pressure. It really has to position itself properly and create good pressure, sort of like a DK or a warrior, but they're not as resilient. So overall, I don't think they're the hardest, but they're certainly not easy. So I'll be putting Assassination probably on the lower end of intermediate. They play a lot like warriors, but warriors in Wrath, I think, are a bit harder than Assassination. I have Combat Rogue. This one is a one-trick pony. You have to get the right setup. You have to really play kind of smart and then pop the killing spree. But after that, you have nothing. You are a very, very, very weak spec when killing spree is gone, as well as so many other cooldowns. So from that reason, I feel like there's just not a ton they can do in general. But getting that proper setup and being able to reliably win can be somewhat difficult. So I'm not too sure where to put them. I think I'm going to end up just putting them somewhere in not difficult, because the way they play is just very easy overall. And I think even at the highest skill level, there's still only so much you can do, because combat really forces you to play this very one-trick pony sort of playstyle. And now we get to Sub-Rogue. Sub-Rogue is very gear dependent, because it plays in a way where you have to have high pressure in coordinated burst moments, because their overall damage is very low, but their burst is very high. So it forces them to play a sort of survival pseudo CC style in Wrath. And by the way, it's way different than BC. BC, you can just pump damage with hemos all the time. In Wrath, you're using daggers, so you're always going to have to manage the positioning requirements. On top of that, there is just so much you have to do with Shadow Dance. In BC, you can Shadow Step kick, Shadow Step gouge, all that, but adding the dance on a moment cooldown adds so much more difficulty, because you have that up all the time. And a really good rogue, which you'll see, and you'll know, oh, that's a really good rogue. That ability just shows how much harder they are than the other specs naturally when I'm playing against a rogue, and I can instantly tell how good they are just by how they're using a Shadow Dance. So Sub overall has the lowest damage output of the three specs with consistent damage. It has the most mobility, as well as the best toolkit and survival, but it has the most weaknesses overall in that it plays with very low resil and doesn't have consistent damage. So the spec's very hard to play. It only works with a few classes and comps, in particular a lot of Shadow Priest comps, and a few ret ones as well, especially early though, but they're quite difficult. And overall, I'd say they're very unforgiving too, because you have no healing, and that's all rogue specs, of course, but they're very difficult. I am wondering whether I'm going to put them right next to hunters or just a little below, but I do think they're pretty hard at a lot of levels, especially when you run into a lot of caster cleaves. When you're running into LSDs, LS priests, LS pallies, in threes. You have to play so carefully and watch your positioning. You have to be so careful with your Cloak of Shadows as well. You can't just pop it willy-nilly. You will die very easily. And I think they're quite hard, so I'll be putting them right here. They could even go here. I mean, Frost Mages are also very difficult. You could even kind of have all three of these here, but I do think Hunters are so hard, in particular Marksman. Maybe you can use this list to determine your next class or spec you're going to level, because maybe you want to get good at something very quickly and you've never played it before, and you might want to avoid some of the things at the top. But maybe you've been aspiring to play one of these classes or specs and didn't know how difficult they would be or how hard it would be to learn them. So if that was helpful to you, please throw the video a like and subscribe, and I'll see you in my next one.